Good morning. And now we are going to read Mark chapter 8, verses 14 to 30. It's going to be on the screen. You can follow along in your Bible anywhere you like. All right. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" They said to him, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him.
So this morning, we have the privilege of welcoming to preach for us Graham Hynds, who is working at Grace Toronto, a church, a sister church of ours. And he's here with his wife, Erica. And full disclosure, he is a son of Bruce Hynds and Janice, who are part of our church. So we're excited to have you here, Graham, and to share the word with us today. And I'll welcome you up here.
Well, it's good on Family Day weekend to be at my family's church. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. And for those of you I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, one of the things you might not know about me is that I'm a person with a visual impairment. So it seems I often end up preaching about texts where Jesus heals blind people. That sort of goes with the territory. And if you see me walking around, I use a white cane to navigate. I've been learning to read Braille very slowly, about the speed of my senior kindergarten daughter, Morgan, is reading regular letters. And I use assisted technology like screen reading software to write emails and read documents and that kind of thing. 2 nights ago, my wife, Erica, and I watched the Disney Plus movie, Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. It's very good. And they even have, God bless Disney Plus, they have descriptive audio. So that's where a narrator sort of speaks the action of what's happening in the scene. So to be honest, it's a pretty good time to be alive if you're a person with a visual impairment, because there's a lot of aids that can help you enjoy this life to the fullest. But being a person with visual impairment can get you into some sticky situations sometimes. Let me tell you about a story that happened a little while ago. I was walking in the path downtown Toronto. And if any of you have been on the path before, you know it is just a rabbit's nest. There are tunnels going this way and that underground. It's very confusing. And so I was walking along the path, completely lost. And I went up to this young woman and I said, "Excuse me, is Richmond Street this way?" She didn't respond. She just stood there. So, I spoke a little bit louder. I said, "Excuse me, is Richmond Street this way?" And it was at that moment it dawned on me. I was speaking to a mannequin in the bay. So in that moment, my poor vision had prevented me from seeing things as they truly were in the situation. But you know what? It's not just me that has that problem. You see, the Bible tells us that when it comes to spiritual things, we all share that same struggle. All of us have blind spots, have distortions in our vision, or trouble seeing spiritual reality as it truly is. And so in a certain sense, we all need eye surgery to have our eyes opened to spiritual truth. In the text that was read for us this morning, we have the story, it's a narrative of the disciples moving from a place of spiritual blindness to a place of spiritual sight. And in the middle of that journey, Mark puts the story of Jesus healing a blind man. And this story isn't here by accident. It is communicating physically what is happening spiritually at that very moment in the lives of the disciples. And our takeaways from the text this morning are this, that all of us in this room, all of us watching online, we need our eyes to be opened. We need our eyes to be opened because we are a people who are quick to forget. We need our eyes to be opened as a process, and we need our eyes to be opened so that we might see Jesus. Let's look at each of those points. Firstly, we need our eyes to be opened because we are a people who are quick to forget. The passage that was read for us this morning is in Mark chapter 8. So if you're following along in a physical Bible and you have Mark 8 open, or if you're following along on your phone and you have Mark 8 open, flip back to Mark 6. Okay, it's one page in most Bibles, or 2 taps on your phone. Okay, back to Mark 6. And at the end of Mark 6, we have the story where Jesus feeds the 5,000. Right, this is a fairly familiar story for those of us who have grown up in the church. We have Jesus and his disciples, they're out in the wilderness. And they're surrounded by a huge crowd, 5,000 men plus women and children. And the people are listening eagerly to Jesus' words. And then they get hungry. And Jesus turns to the disciples and says, we need to give these people something to eat. Well, the disciples, they throw their hands up in the air. They say, it's impossible. Look at this huge crowd. You know, with a year's wages, we couldn't buy enough food for these people. And there's nowhere nearby selling food. It's impossible. And Jesus takes a few loaves and a few fish. He does a miracle. He provides for the needs of all the people who are there listening, with enough even to take up a leftover. That's the end of Mark 6. So now we jump back, a mere one page in most Bibles, 2 taps on your phone. We get to Mark 8. And the beginning of Mark 8, the disciples find themselves in a fairly familiar situation. They're in the wilderness with Jesus. They're surrounded by a big crowd, 4,000 people, plus women and children. The people are hanging on every word of Jesus, and they get hungry. And Jesus turns to his disciples and says, we need to give these people something to eat. So naturally, one of the disciples says, okay, Lord, I remember this from a chapter and a half ago. We have some fish, we have some loaves. Can you provide miraculously again, right? That's what happens. No, that's not what happens. Yet again, the disciples throw up their hands. They say, who could feed all these people? It's impossible. We almost reading it, we want to reach into the pages of the Bible, grab them by the collar, and give them a shake, don't we? You know, how could you be so forgetful? Surely if we saw Jesus feeding 5,000 people a chapter and a half ago, we would have more faith. But you know, Mark doesn't share this story of the disciples so that we can pat ourselves on the back and feel superior to them. Mark wants us to see ourselves in the disciples because we're not so different from them. We too are a people quick to forget the faithfulness of God. Let me tell you a story from my own life. Before I came to work at Grace Toronto, I served for 9 years on staff with a campus Christian ministry called Power to Change Students. You might be familiar with the older name Campus Crusade for Christ. And I worked for 9 years. I was at McGill University, the University of Toronto, and I also spent my last couple years as a staff trainer, onboarding new staff into the ministry. And during that time, one of my responsibilities of my job was to fundraise my salary. So I had individuals and churches who were on my support team donating $50 a month, $100 a month, and so on, so that I could dedicate my full energies to working on campus. And during that time, God was very faithful. I always had a comfortable home to live in, always had enough food. I had enough money, I was able to be generous to the church I was going to. And I even had leftover money to go to restaurants, buy clothes, go to the symphony, and so on. God was faithful. And yet, I still felt anxious about my finances. And even now that I work at a church, I work at Grace Toronto, I'm not supported by individuals giving directly to me anymore. Even now that I'm drawing my salary from Grace Toronto, I still feel that anxiety. What if the church has to downsize and I lose my job? With inflation going up and gobbling up more and more of my spending power, will I be able to continue to provide the kind of life for my family that I want to provide for them? If interest rates are still high next year, my mortgage is coming up for renewal. What's that going to look like in our family life? And on the list goes. Now, those aren't foolish things to think about. It's actually, it's good to be proactive and plan for these kinds of things. But I think sometimes the anxiety that I feel in those moments, perhaps, is reflecting that I'm a little bit like the disciples. And I'm failing to look at a new situation in life in light of the past faithfulness of God. I'm being quick to forget. So what about you? In what ways are you quick to forget? Could it be that God has been faithful, walking with you in the past, but it's hard to remember that when you look into an uncertain future? Graduation. Competing for employment in a fast-changing marketplace. A looming recession. Deteriorating health. Could it be that as you look at your life, you see all the ways that God has been shaping your character, refining you, making you more Christ-like, but when you look at this one particular sin, it's really hard to remember that God has been shaping you elsewhere. And so we, like the disciples, we need our eyes to be open because we are a people who are quick to forget the faithfulness of God from the past. We need our eyes to be opened as well as a process. We move forward in our narrative to the incident of the healing of the blind man. So Mark has started the story by reminding us of the spiritual blindness of the disciples. And then he puts this miracle. And it's a weird miracle, isn't it? This is the only miracle performed by Jesus where it seems like it doesn't work on the first try. Right, so what's going on here? Was this blindness somehow more stubborn to cure than it was with Bartimaeus? Why didn't this man go from blindness to 20/20 vision on the first try? Well, most Bible commentators agree that Jesus is acting with he's acting very intentionally in this healing because he's depicting physically what's happening at that very moment spiritually in the lives of the disciples. You see, when the disciples first began following Jesus, they really didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he was all about. They were blind to his true identity. And as they've been journeying with him, their eyes are slowly opening. They're starting to understand who he is and what he's all about, but they still really don't get it. It's like looking at trees walking around and not being sure if they're people or trees. And the next scene in our narrative this morning is going to be a moment when the disciples finally have sight, when their eyes are opened. So the fact is that having our eyes opened, we see in the case of the disciples, it's a process. It's a journey. And I think that should be a real word of encouragement and comfort to us this morning. Because it means that wherever you're at on your spiritual faith, whether you're someone who's just exploring Christianity or you've been a Christian your whole life, as long as you can remember, wherever you're at on that journey, you're on a process. And Jesus wants to walk with you. He's not going to wait until you hit a certain level of holiness or righteousness before he comes to you. And so if you're here exploring the faith, he's eager to join you where you are at on your journey. Embrace the process. Bring your questions. Bring all your questions to Pastor Albert. He will be happy to dialogue with you about that. And embrace the process. And likewise, if you're here and you've been a Christian as long as you can remember, and perhaps you're feeling discouraged this morning, you're not as mature as you'd like in a certain area of your faith, guess what? Jesus is not done with you yet. He's not done with you yet. Your story isn't over. It's a process. Perhaps on the flip side, some of us need to be challenged. Maybe we've been a Christian for a long time and we kind of feel good about ourselves, you know? We've got this whole thing figured out. Keep looking at the disciples because the spiritual journey is increasingly having those blind spots wiped away. And we too have blind spots. Our journey isn't over yet. So let this word be an encouragement and a challenge to us that having our eyes opened, it's a process. We need our eyes to be open. Let's turn to the last scene, so when the disciples identify Jesus as the Christ. We need our eyes to be opened so that we can see Jesus as he truly is. This final scene in our narrative this morning, this is the climax of the first half of the Gospel of Mark. The first half of the Gospel of Mark, from chapters 1 to chapter 8, verse 30, the question that is repeatedly being asked of the reader is, who is this Jesus? Who is this Jesus that can drive out demons and heal people? Who is this Jesus who can walk on water and calm the seas? Who is this Jesus that can do a miracle to feed these people? Who is this Jesus who opens the eyes of the blind? And at last we reach the climax when Jesus turns and looks at his own disciples. And he asks them the question, who do people say that I am? Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets. But then Jesus makes it very personal. And what about you? You who have been with me since the beginning, what about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter declares, you are the Messiah. You are the Christ. You are the anointed King of Israel. You see, Mark is telling us that to see clearly spiritually, to see Jesus for who he is to see him as the Christ. So we need our eyes to be open to see Jesus as he is. Now, you might be here this morning and you're thinking, well, okay, there's not much here for me in this point because I believe Jesus is the Christ, right? I've already done that. But I want to challenge you, keep looking at Peter. Because if you read the rest of the Gospel of Mark from chapter 8 to chapter 16, we're going to see that Jesus continues to defy Peter's expectation about what the Messiah is supposed to look like. This isn't the pinnacle of Peter's understanding of who Jesus is. In a sense, it's almost a new beginning. And the rest of his journey is going to be understanding more and more of just who this Messiah is. Jesus is going to provoke Peter. And that's a good thing because we want to know Jesus as he truly is, not as we want to make him out to be. You know, I think there's a real tendency these days, and perhaps there always has been, to put Jesus into a box. You know, you can sometimes hear this in political discourse. People will say, well, you know, surely Jesus would favor this political party because of their position protecting the lives of the unborn. Or perhaps Jesus would prefer this political party because they're passionate defenders of his creation. But the fact is we can't put Jesus in a box. He doesn't fit neatly into a box because he's a real person. C.S. Lewis, the children's author, very wisely put it in his book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He's not a tame lion. And so I wonder, what are the ways that Jesus has provoked you recently? What are some of the blind spots he's been wiping away from your eyes recently? In one of my recent devotional times, I was reading a parable that Jesus told. It was about a rich vineyard owner. And this vineyard owner went out at sunrise and he hired a number of day laborers to come and work in the vineyard. And he said, I'm going to pay you a day's wage to do this. So the guys came and they started working. He went out again at 9 a.m. He got more workers. He went out again at noon and got more workers. He went out at 3 and got more workers. And he went out at 5 and got a couple more workers until sunset. And at the end of the day, he went to those who had come at 5 p.m. and he gave them a full day's wage. And so those who came at sunrise, they got excited, right? They thought they were going to get, if that's what you get for coming at 5 p.m., what are we going to get who have been here all day? And yet, when the owner of the vineyard came to them, they got the day's wage that they had agreed upon at the beginning of the day. And the men were frustrated. And the vineyard owner responded, "Are you jealous because I am generous?" I was provoked by that story, and perhaps you're sitting here and you're feeling provoked. But you know what? That's a good thing, because we want to see who Jesus really is and what his character really is. We don't want to just try to fit him into one of our neat little boxes. In the 70s, a sci-fi thriller came out, a novel called The Stepford Wives. And in The Stepford Wives, it's a story about this fictional town called Stepford, and this family move into the town, and they find it's a really weird place. All the wives in the town are gorgeous, completely subservient to their husbands, and all they do is go grocery shopping, cook for their husbands, and just do whatever they tell them. Husbands, you might be thinking, this sounds great. But it's not. It's terrifying, actually. Because what they find are, these women aren't real women. They're these automatons that have been made purely to meet the needs of their husbands. And what's interesting is the story kind of unpacks this idea of what is a real, genuine relationship. And it's kind of pointing the finger that you can't have a relationship with an automaton. And so I think we need to beware having a Stepford Jesus made in our image. We want to know him as he truly is. And so we need our eyes to be opened to see Jesus. Our narrative this morning has told us we need our eyes to be opened because we are quick to forget. We need our eyes to be opened as a process, and we need our eyes to be opened so that we might see Jesus. A number of years ago, I had a retinal surgery, and if you've interacted with a family member or friend who's had one of these procedures, one of the ways that they address the problem in your eye is by injecting a gas bubble into your eye. It kind of holds everything in place. And what's challenging is as the bubble dissolves, as your body just absorbs it, it takes a while to do that. It's very challenging to see through the bubble. You really can't see anything while it's dissolving. And so I found that frustrating, that for a number of weeks, I couldn't see anything at all. And so you can imagine what a relief it was, what a joy it was as that bubble went away and the world around me became clearer. And I was able to see the family, I was able to see the faces of those that I love. And that's the Christian journey. It's having those things in our eyes fade away so that we can more and more clearly see the one that we love, Jesus Christ. What a joy it is, what a privilege it is to go through that experience in this life and in the life to come to see him with perfect clarity. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Amen.